Today we are going to have a comprehensive summary, application, and evaluation of monetary models with flexible prices and wages. Like always, let's repeat the big picture to show you where we are in macroeconomic theory. We start with the static version of the RBC model, or real business cycle model, which focuses on fluctuations of the labor market. In this model, we derive the optimal condition for the consumer and the firm when they have to make a static decision within each period. This optimal condition is also called intratemporal condition. We then extend the baseline model to consider some realistic assumptions, such as search and matching costs and Nash bargaining, arriving at the DMP model. Next, we build the dynamic version of the RBC model, which focuses on fluctuations of the credit or capital market. In this model, we derive the optimal condition for the consumer and the firm when they have to make a decision across periods. This optimal condition is also called intertemporal condition. Like in the static model, we extend the baseline dynamic model by considering some realistic financial frictions, such as interest rate spread and limited commitment. Building on the static and dynamic versions, we then come to the all-in-one RBC model, in which the intra- and intertemporal conditions still hold. This is the microeconomic foundation for any modern macroeconomic models. This semester starts with introducing money into RBC model. We discussed how money is defined, measured, supplied, and demanded, as well as the monetary equilibrium condition, the Fisher equation, to link the nominal side and the real side of the economy. We have seen how neutrality of money and non-neutrality of money can result from different assumptions without resorting to nominal frictions. We are therefore in a good position to wrap up everything today to summarize some key conclusions up to now. What we are going to do today is not new, but a consolidation. After this lecture, we are going to introduce another type of monetary models which assume nominal frictions or price rigidities. They are the new Keynesian models. They are the current working horse models used by most central banks in the world. And after that, we will extend the model into the international dimension. There are two types of economic analysis. The positive analysis attempts to describe how the economy works, while the normative analysis tries to prescribe how the economy should work. Let's get to know the world before we can change it. So this slide summarizes the basic conclusions of positive analysis. To model the economy, we have three agents. The consumer maximizes her utility under some resources constraints. The firm maximizes its profit under some technology constraints. And the government simply tries to make its ends meet in present value terms. These conclusions describe the individual optimality features of an equilibrium. On the other hand, equilibrium requires market clearing conditions. That is, there's no excessive demand or supply in any output market, input market, or money market. According to the Walras law, only n-1 market clearing conditions are necessary because the nth market will automatically clear in this case. The competitive equilibrium requires individual optimality condition and the market clearing condition to hold. However, not all markets are competitive, so one can add on other imperfections onto the market, such as search and matching, monopoly, information, or frictions. They will lead to different conclusions. Now let's summarize some properties or theorems we have derived from these models based on which some policy implications can then be drawn in the normative analysis. In the RBC model, we have derived the first and second fundamental theorems of welfare economics. They simply state that competitive equilibrium is always the best way of allocation of economic resources. Leave it to the market as long as it is competitive. We then derive two theorems related to the fiscal policy and the monetary policy respectively. The regarding equivalence theorem states that the timing of tax, which is one of the fiscal policies, does not matter under some restrictive assumptions. And the classical dichotomy theorem states that monetary policy does not matter for the real side of the economy at all. Policy implications based on these theorems differ across the two most influential schools of thought in macroeconomics. The first gang of economists are classical and neoclassical. The neoclassicals are new because they use microeconomic foundation for modeling after 1980s, which is what we are doing here. But they share very similar assumptions and conclusions with the old classicals in the 19th century. They think that the main driver of business cycles is the supply-side fluctuations, such as total factor productivity. Therefore, fiscal policy and monetary policy are of no use, according to the regarding equivalence and classical dichotomy theorems. To summarize the classicals, the best you can do is to do nothing. On the contrary, the Keynesians and new Keynesians believe that, at least in the short run, business cycles are exacerbated by market imperfections, such as nominal frictions, irrationality, and coordination failure. Therefore, demand-side counter-cyclical policies are of great help to kick the economy out of the recession. They advocate active interventions from the government. So this lecture's objective is to know where we are standing at in the literature of business cycles. To do that, you will have to know how to measure the productivity and how to measure business cycles. And then we will apply the RBC model we have covered up to now and try to assess how well it can replicate the data we observe in the business cycle in reality. So let me walk you through the macroeconomic literature on business cycles to see how our knowledge on macroeconomic theory evolves in history. The earliest school of thought in modern economics is, as we said, the classical school of thought. Without using mathematical models and micro-foundations, they use only logical arguments to conclude that money does not affect the real side of the economy, or the classical dichotomy. Based on this conclusion, they argued for free market and minimum intervention from the government. However, the Great Depression in the 1930s shook the root of classical school of thought. Keynes and his followers argued that markets are not as perfect as the classicals assumed. There are all sorts of market failures, such as nominal frictions, and the government can and should take a more active role in reducing business cycles. Both fiscal policy and monetary policy can be used to stabilize the economy, and this became the mainstream macroeconomic theory after the Second World War. The only challenge to the then mainstream Keynesian policies was the Friedman-Lucas model in the 1960s, who argued that too much abuse of monetary policy would confuse the market signal and lead to ineffectiveness of policies due to the information asymmetry. This is exactly what happened in the 1970s during the oil crisis. The monetarism then became mainstream in conducting monetary policy. Since the late 1970s and early 1980s, a new approach to macroeconomic modeling initially developed by the new classicals gains its popularity. This new approach combines rational expectation and micro-foundation into macroeconomic modeling, including the new classical, the new monetarist, and the new Keynesian models. A key distinction between these new models from the new Keynesian models is whether or not the prices are sticky or whether or not there is nominal friction. The debate on this key assumption of price rigidity is still going on today in the macroeconomic literature. My own PhD thesis was done on this. An early answer to this fundamental question was offered by the Nobel Prize winners Kirtland and Prescott in 1982. Their method is to challenge a pure real business cycle model to replicate the observed data. Their logic was very straightforward. If the pure real business cycle model or the pure RBC model can replicate the data, then money is not important, and the ad hoc assumption of nominal friction is not necessary. To everyone's surprise, they did it. A real business cycle model can explain the majority of fluctuations or business cycles observed in the data. Therefore, as the most important evidence for new classical school of thought, they argued that it is the real shocks, such as productivity shocks on the supply side, rather than the monetary shocks that drive the business cycles. To properly evaluate the RBC model, we need to answer two measurement questions. First, we need to know how to measure productivity Z so that we can have a good understanding of the cause of business cycles. Second, we need to know how to measure business cycles per se so that we can have a good understanding of the effect of the real productivity shocks. We have talked about the solo residual in Chapter 4. To recall, it is the residual fluctuations of output after taking account of the fluctuations of labor and capital inputs. Therefore, it is a measure of productivity shock. We can see from the figure that the solo residual is a very persistent variable. It tends to stay above the trend if it is already positive, and vice versa. As found out by Kirtland and Prescott, the fluctuations of output can largely be attributed to the fluctuations of the solo residual or productivity shock. The RBC model can match the data, so new classical economists conclude that money is not important in explaining business cycles, and there is no need for nominal frictions. Now let's graphically apply the RBC model to explain business cycles in the labor market, output market, and money market. Assume there is an exogenous permanent rise in productivity. The immediate effect is on the labor market. According to the intratemporal condition of the firm, a rise in Z increases the marginal product of labor. To restore the optimality condition for the firm, it cannot change W on the right-hand side because it is a price taker, but it can adjust the labor demand to decrease the marginal product of labor on the left-hand side. To decrease the marginal product, labor demand has to increase according to the diminishing law of marginal product. That leads to a right shift of labor demand curve. However, this is not the end yet. A higher labor demand means a higher lifetime wealth for the consumer, so consumption demand will increase. This will feed back to the intratemporal condition of the consumer. A higher C will only be offset by a proportionate increase in leisure to keep the balance between the two sides of the condition. A rise in leisure means a drop in labor supply, so the labor supply curve will shift to the left. However, this is a second round effect, so the magnitude on the supply curve is smaller than that of the demand curve. Accordingly, we can see all the effects on the labor market and output market. We can see a rise in wage during the boom and a rise in employment in the labor market. And there is a drop in interest rate and a rise in output level. Now let's continue our analysis and turn to the money market. We know that interest rates will drop according to the analysis in the previous slide. In this case, money demand will shift to the right, or money demand will increase because money demand is a negative function of interest rate, as we have seen in the previous lectures. In this case, because money supply doesn't change, so price will drop from P1 to P2. It can be shown in a different perspective if we use the production function to show the shift of Z, then it is an increase from the lower level to the higher level. And when the production function shifts up, you need to increase your employment from N1 to N2 to increase the output from Y1 to Y2. And not only the output level increases, the productivity also increases. The productivity is shown by the slope of the productivity of the production function. Now let's summarize and compare what the business cycle data show and what the real business cycle model predicts. We can see that the model can perfectly match the fluctuations in consumption, in investment, in price level, in employment, in real wage, and in the average labor productivity. Most of it is the same and in line with the stylized facts observed in data. However, there are two discrepancies between the data and the model. The first one is the money supply. Usually in the data, we see a pro-cyclicality in money supply, but in our model, the money supply is acyclical because we can't change money supply in our model, which is assumed as exogenous. The second discrepancy is in the labor market. The employment in the data is procyclical. That is, you have higher employment rate when there is a boom, and vice versa. We do have procyclicality in our model as well, but the change in our model is very, very small in magnitude. So quantitatively speaking, the RBC model is not able to match the change in employment in magnitude. The failure of the RBC model in explaining the labor market has been addressed by the search and matching model we introduced in the last semester. There are two additional failures of the RBC model in explaining the money market due to the classical dichotomy or neutrality of money. The first is that the money supply is procyclical in data, but acyclical in the RBC model. One solution to address this failure is to endogenize money supply. The rationale behind is that central banks are supposed to keep the price level stable, so money supply needs to be endogenously adjusted to do that. There are two channels to do it. First, when Z rises in the boom, output level rises, so money demand rises. To maintain the price stability, money supply needs to rise in proportion to obtain the money market equilibrium. Second, the rise in Z also makes interest rate and price level drop. To feed back on that, monetary policy needs to inject more money supply to cancel that pressure. Voila! Money supply is therefore procyclical now after this simple additional assumption. The second failure of the RBC model in explaining the money market is that money supply tends to lead real GDP. But the original RBC model cannot do that. this problem is addressed by the timing difference in the dynamic setting. On the one hand, the banking sector provides credit in advance, so output production is only carried out in a later date. It leads to the leading feature of money supply. On the other hand, the central bank usually adopts preemptive feedback policy, so money supply is adjusted in advance before the actual problem reveals itself. So the second failure is then solved by a more detailed assumption of endogenous money supply. So now let's summarize the policy implications of the RBC model, which we have already mentioned several times in this lecture and in this course. Under the RBC model, the business cycles are simply optimal responses of the economy to the fluctuations in the productivity Z, and nothing can be done about them because they are basically exogenous. You can't control them. So there is no role for monetary policies to stabilize the real side of the economy because of the neutrality of money. Moreover, there is no role for fiscal policies as well to correct for inefficiencies or market failures because the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics excludes anything about that. If the market is already efficient or competitive, then the best thing you can do is to do nothing. The RBC model is of course not perfect. There are many criticisms about its theoretical assumptions, but attacks on assumptions are more or less a matter of opinion. There is, however, a more critical hit from the empirical perspective. Some economists find that the solo residual can be a systematically biased measure of productivity. The key of this criticism is the variable utilization of capital and labor inputs. For example, in booms, these inputs are usually fully utilized, but in recessions, they are usually underutilized or furloughed rather than destroyed or dismissed. Therefore, the number of input is higher than it seems due to underutilization. A consequence is that the productivity tends to be underestimated during recessions. Let's use a numerical example to illustrate this. Assume the initial values of productivity is equal to 1, capital is equal to 100, and labor is equal to 50. Using the Cobb-Douglas production function provided here, we compute the output equals to 61.6. Now let's look at the recession. Assume only 95% of the capital is used and 90% of the employment is working. Therefore, K is now 95 and N is equal to 45. However, this true situation of underutilization is not observed, so economists may mistakenly still use K equals 100 and N equals to 50. Even if the true productivity is still equal to 1, the estimated productivity using the solo residual and the output would be equal to 0.915, resulting in an underestimation of the productivity, whose true value is actually equal to 1. To summarize, the explanation power of the RBC model may be illusionary due to the biased estimation of the productivity. If this is true, then the importance of real shocks and nominal shocks should be reviewed. This lecture comprehensively summarized what we have covered for RBC model, both the pure RBC model and the augmented RBC model with money. Please do take a time to read chapter 13 of Williamson and try to do the self-tests. Have fun!